If you've purchased beef since the pandemic, you've definitely noticed how much it's gone up. It's basically gone up in North America about 16% each year for about 5 years. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly why it makes sense economically and also environmentally in a mathematical sense, not a cultural sense. And I know that's a shocker. At the end of this video, I'm going to give you a really good reason why the Australian beef market is even bigger than you think. It's really poised to be the most dominant force by magnitudes in the next few decades. It's out of control. I don't even buy Canadian steak anymore. I buy ground beef, I buy chicken. I can't afford steak, to be honest. I can't afford a good Canadian steak. This studio's in my tool shed and I have a day job. Likewise, you've probably noticed, like I have, the Australian beef that is in our grocery shelves that is sometimes up to half the price of our domestic beef. You might have done like I did as well and go online and rage about this. This makes no sense. Why are we getting beef from halfway across the world? At first glance, it seems almost comical that beef that travels all the way around the globe, Magellan's beef, I like to call it as a joke, is somehow half the price as the beef down the road. I was very confused by this myself, and I got tired of ripping into it. I wanted to find out why. There has to be more of a reason than just the grocery store wants to make more money. However, I decided to look deeper into the beef market and the trade market, the micro-macro economics of Australian beef and how it relates to our market in North America. What I found is quite surprising. And it makes a lot of sense when you understand all of the things that are happening, because there's a few. It's not just one. There's about 3 things that are happening. So here's some key background knowledge it's really important to know about the difference between North American cattle and Australian cattle, because they're very different. The whole process is different. Raising them is completely different depending on where they are located. And this has a lot to do with climate, of course. North American cattle are raised to slaughter on a faster timeline. This is because they spend more time in high-calorie feedlots, being sort of given higher calories, so they grow faster. In fact, we call this grain finishing, and most of our cattle in North America are grain finished. They spend the last part of their life eating grain before they're slaughtered. Now, Australian cattle graze on grass their entire lives. North American cattle, part of their lives. Australian cattle, most of them, their whole life. Although there are some that still go to feedlots, but it's less than half of North American, and they're a lot shorter timeline in the feedlot than in North America. Most Australian cattle that are grass-fed their whole lives end their life cycle eating the same grass. It's called being grass-finished. So there's no extra work being done to bring them to slaughter. And this takes longer than grain-finished cattle in North America. So that's important to know. It takes longer for a cow to become edible in Australia than North America. So by logic, you think that that would be a big problem because obviously longer to grow, more work, more time. But that's not true. It's a game of volume. The herds are huge. They take care of themselves. And that's all you have to do. Whereas North American cattle have to be taken care of much more closely, monitored, moved around. You have to make sure they don't freeze to death. And if there isn't enough grass, you have to feed them by hand. So you have to make sure they also don't starve to death. So this is where it got neat for me, because I always thought I'm just being beef from different places, but they're actually very different products on average, okay? Because there's going to be some Australian beef that is like Canadian beef, and there's going to be some Canadian beef that's like Australian beef. But on average, they're very different. The grain-finished North American cattle has a more marbled content on its meat. That's valuable for restaurants. That's valuable for people that are connoisseurs of steak. They will pay more for that marble. Australian beef is leaner. Many market consumers aren't too picky, but your steak connoisseurs will want a more marbled finish. So one is more valuable for steaks, one is more attainable for just sheer protein. The higher value marbled North American meat ends up being bought by people that will pay more, basically. It's a free market. So restaurants that will buy a steak for $100 and sell it for $150, whereas myself, I will not pay that much for that same steak. I'm completely outbid. I'm not going to pay $110 for it. Road, because I'm in Canada, the steak down the road ends up going who knows where, Japan, somewhere in Europe. It could go anywhere, right? I mean, that shouldn't have to happen because surely there's enough cattle for everybody here. We have cows everywhere, but the reality is North American, Canada and American, cattle herds have been shrinking for many years. We don't have a lot of excess beef to sort of push out the influence of the Australian beef that's coming. So the Australian beef is moving more into our market, and we're not creating more beef to kind of flood it out. So the Australian beef, just by osmosis, ends up moving more into the market, becoming more dominant because it's cheaper. It's pretty simple. I'm not going to go into the politics of subsidizing herds and whatnot. That's not the scope of this video. Now, for the first little while, people were also more culturally biased towards the beef. They would pay a little bit more for the domestic beef. They would almost shun the Australian beef, right? But as the gap grew wider, it became less about money and more about need. Do you want to actually ever have beef in your dinner, right? The answer is no, and you can't afford the Canadian steak. Well, I guess you're not going to eat beef. But most people will just, suck it up and eventually buy the Australian beef. So that brings us to the idea of energy and shipping. And surely the Australian beef is far more inefficient just because of the distance in the world. That's not really true when you break down the actual energy of both their production and their shipping. Let's start with the beginning of the life cycle, just to make it easy to understand. So North American cattle need more care, and they're going to need more feed. So if we consider their grazing openly on an endless field, they don't need any hay or anything like that, then it breaks even with Australia. At some point, the North American cattle are going to need lots of feed to finish them. And feed is extremely energy intensive to create. Every bushel of grain, it requires mechanical seeding, mechanical fertilizing, harvesting, possibly irrigation. That is a lot of fuel, a lot of energy. Look at the Australian cattle on the other side who spend their whole life grazing, and they're finish grazing, they're grass finished. So they have to live longer to get to the slaughterhouse, but they don't use as much food, and they use barely any energy to get there. So if you compare the two just from the beginning, the North American method is already more expensive. Surely shipping changes the balance, right? Well, this is where it gets kind of weird because the beef you're getting down the road, unless you get it like butchered at the actual farmer, which happens, but most of it's going to a distribution center of sorts, it's being transported massive distances in North America, and it's mostly being done by truck. And Australia has us beat in every way. They have trucks too, but they have things called road trains, which I just learned about the other day. It's a great King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard song. Road train is wild. It's a massive transport truck with like 3 trailers attached to it. We can't possibly do that on North American roads. So the whole truck transport's already more efficient. Australian beef comes on ships through the ocean, massive cargo ships. The cost in terms of carbon emissions and money per kilometer on an ocean ship it isn't even pennies compared to a freight train or a truck. It's far cheaper. It's just time. And if you have endless supply of herds, time isn't an issue. So we like to think it comes from far, but it's actually just slower, but it's way cheaper. Oh, another thing too, the Australian processing plants for beef are located on the coast. Their entire market is designed for export, which adds another level of efficiency. It's important to note that North American countries have really good trade relations, that there's very little tariffs or taxation, if any, and that makes it even more profitable for beef to come into the market. So we talked about how the beef is easier to produce, cheaper to make. It gets here easier, although slower, but it gets even weirder, and I promised something at the end that really blew my mind. It's not just steak that they're winning at. They're winning at live cattle as well. Here's a tragic example. If you look at the Amazon right now, you're going to see lots of deforestation in a certain pattern. There's lots of great YouTube videos where people are going around these places. You should check them out. The Amazon and many other parts of Asia and South America are being leveled for cattle. North American cattle aren't going to do as well genetically in this tropical climate with parasites and stress. There's no winter, but there is often a wet and dry season, which is a totally different ball game for mammals. Australian cattle herds have been genetically selected, and there's some wild breeds, one that's even called the Droughtmaster, which is unreal. These breeds in Australia have genetically drifted towards surviving a harsh climate. So right now, the Australian live cattle are being exported to Asia, to South America, to the hottest, driest countries in the world, and they're becoming the key genetic herds, thus strengthening trade agreements with Australia and creating sort of more Australian beef by proxy being shipped around